What made Britain one of the wealthiest empires in the world? Was it naval power, military might, industrial ingenuity? Or was it something darker, something buried under centuries of silence and denial? This is the story of how human lives, millions of them, were bought, sold, and brutalized to feed the rise of empire. This is the story of the transatlantic slave trade. Our journey begins not in Britain, but on the scorching coasts of West Africa, in the shadow of kingdoms like Dahomey, Ashanti, and Oyo. These were powerful African nations with their own economies, politics, and in some cases, their own systems of slavery. But what happened next would reshape the world. In the late 1500s, English merchants began prowling the coasts. Men like John Hawkins was the first Englishman to profit from human trafficking. In 1562, Hawkins captured hundreds of Africans and sold them in Spanish colonies. His ship bore a peculiar name, the Jesus of Lubeck. It was, grotesquely, the beginning of a new form of slavery, one driven not by debt or conquest, but by global capitalism. At first, Britain was a minor player. Spain and Portugal dominated. But as the 1600s wore on, the British appetite for profit exploded. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These were crops that promised astronomical wealth if you could get the labor to work them. Indentured servants, mostly poor white Europeans, had filled this role in the early days. They agreed to work for years to pay off debts. But there was a problem. They eventually had to be freed. Slavery, permanent and inherited, was more profitable. And so, the English, like their rivals, turned to Africa. By the early 1600s, British ships were crossing the Atlantic in what would become known as the Triangular Trade, where manufactured goods left ports like Bristol, Liverpool, and London, heading to West Africa, and goods like guns, beads, alcohol, and textiles were exchanged for human beings. Captured Africans, men, women, and children, were chained, marched to the coast, and imprisoned in dungeons. Then came the Middle Passage, the forced voyage of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. Imagine this: a ship designed to carry 200 people, instead packed with 500. They're shackled together, forced to lie in their own filth, barely able to move. Disease sweeps through the hold. The stench is indescribable. As one slave, Olaudah Equiano, wrote, "I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me." Equiano was kidnapped as a child, sold, transported. He survived the Middle Passage and would later become one of the loudest voices against slavery. But most never lived to tell the tale. Around 2 million Africans died during the voyage alone. And for those who survived, the ordeal was far from over. Arriving in the Caribbean, Brazil, or the American colonies, they were sold like cattle. They were branded, auctioned, stripped of identity and name, and stripped of humanity. This was chattel slavery, a system where people were property and their children too. The British plantations in the Caribbean, particularly Jamaica and Barbados, became death camps. The average life expectancy of an enslaved African in these colonies was just 26 years. Beatings were routine. Rebellion meant execution. Then in 1661, the Barbados Slave Code was written into law. It enshrined the brutality. It gave slave owners total power. Enslaved Africans had no legal rights. They were denied humanity, not by accident but by design. Sugar plantations flooded London with wealth. Cotton helped fuel the textile mills of Manchester. Tobacco enriched the merchant class. And 3 British port cities grew rich beyond imagination: Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow. In fact, by the 18th century, Britain was the dominant slaving nation in the world. It's estimated that between 12 to 15 million Africans were forcibly taken to the Americas. Some historians believe the true number is even higher. Now, some might argue, but didn't Africans sell their own people? And yes, African kingdoms did play a role, but European demand distorted existing systems of bondage, and guns and goods were traded for captives. But this does not erase Britain's responsibility. It magnifies it. Because without the European market, the mass commodification of human life would not have scaled into the largest forced migration in human history. And yet, resistance was everywhere. On slave ships, captives staged revolts. Dozens are recorded, though most failed. On plantations, enslaved people resisted in quiet and bold ways. They worked slowly, sabotaged equipment, sang songs from home, told forbidden stories, preserved culture, and ran away from plantations and their masters. In Jamaica, a group of slaves called the Maroons escaped into the mountains, forming independent communities and waging guerrilla war on their former masters. And the British, for all their firepower, could not extinguish the flame of resistance. But back in Britain, the winds of change began to stir. The Enlightenment brought new ideas: liberty, equality, rights. But it wasn't just philosophers who challenged slavery, it was the people. The abolitionist movement grew in the 1770s. William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson. These were names etched into the moral struggle, but perhaps the most powerful testimony came not from white campaigners, but from black survivors. Olaudah Equiano's autobiography, published in 1789, was a sensation. He described in harrowing detail his kidnapping, enslavement, and eventual freedom. His voice pierced through prejudice. By 1807, public pressure and activism forced Parliament to act. The Abolition of the Slave Trade Act passed, but don't be mistaken, slavery itself wasn't ended. It wasn't until 1833, under the Slavery Abolition Act, that enslaved people across the British Empire were officially freed. But even though this act had passed, injustice persisted. Slave owners, not the enslaved, were compensated for their loss of property. The British government paid out what would today be billions of pounds. The enslaved, they got nothing. Instead, they were placed under the so-called apprenticeship system. It meant continuing to work for their former masters, for a pittance, for up to 6 more years. It was exploitation, by another name. But in Jamaica, the patience ran out. In 1865, Paul Bogle, a Baptist deacon, led a march to Morant Bay. His people had suffered for decades. They were denied land, justice, and opportunity. To start with, they protested peacefully. They petitioned the Crown. And when they were ignored, they rose. Known as the Morant Bay Rebellion, it was met with ferocious repression. The British executed over 400 Jamaicans, including Bogle himself, and they destroyed villages and imprisoned thousands. But news of the rebellion sent shockwaves throughout Britain. It exposed the lie that emancipation had brought freedom. Because the truth is, the legacy of slavery never ended. It morphed into segregation. It echoed in poverty. It lingered in prejudice. It reverberates even today. The transatlantic slave trade was not a footnote in British history. It was a cornerstone. It funded cities. It built banks. It shaped empire. And its scars run deep. In Britain, in the Caribbean, in the Americas, and across the African continent. Millions of lives were stolen. But their voices, suppressed for centuries, are finally being heard. From Equiano to Bogle, from unnamed rebels and African slaves to modern descendants, their stories demand remembrance. The British Empire, for all its might and splendor, was built not just on exploration or trade, but also on suffering. And to truly understand empire, we must confront this truth, not to wallow in guilt, but to honor the memory of those whose lives were taken, and to ensure that history is never repeated in silence. In our next episode, we explore British colonialism in Africa, the Berlin Conference, the scramble for the continent, and the rise of African nationalism. But for now, we leave you with a question. What does it mean to build an empire on human lives? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below or subscribe for more documentaries. And don't forget, history isn't just about dates and names, it's about people. Real people, real lives, and we should never forget them.